news. And this is an update on that session because things are changing quite quickly. So the purpose of today is to round up some of the bare sort of basic information, but also to focus in on a couple of areas that are emerging as the most important, and in particular accessibility statements and what's happening from the government side, and then also some good practice about accessibility statements. So welcome to the webinar. I'm going to get started. As I say, I'm Mark Walker. I'm from AbilityNet. I'm the head of marketing. I have Abby and Natalie who are here, both accessibility consultants, with George from Kent County Council and Ben from the University of Kent. We're going to be running through a few different things today. We're going to be looking at an update on what's happening around this legislation, who's doing what's the government doing, how those decisions coming together, because Abby's actually directly involved in some of that stuff. Then Natalie's going to talk us through the basics of accessibility statements, because we know that's a question a lot of people are asking. And then George and Ben are going to talk through how they've built their accessibility statement, the work they're doing together on that, which is very interesting. There'll be time for questions and answers at the end, but also I'll be monitoring. My role on here is probably mostly around hosting and monitoring. So if you have questions and you want to pop them into the open questions box, then it also means that other people can see them. So that's a great advantage of doing it that way, because you then don't have to keep asking the same question. If you see something in there that you want to get answered, then I'll be doing my best to keep track of that. So use the questions and answers panel as we go along. Great. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start a poll. Oh, that didn't come up. We got too quickly. I've got a couple of questions here so that we know a little bit about you. So hopefully the poll will be on your screen now, which will ask you two questions. One of them is, how confident are you about meeting the requirements? And the other one is about which type of organization you're from. So interestingly, we asked this question at the start of the previous session, which is 2 or 3 months ago now. So I'm hoping that people are starting to lean more towards the more confident end. It may be that you've had long enough to work out that actually you're less confident than you were. Seem to remember it was fairly middling. I don't actually have the numbers in front of me, but so most of you voted now, and I can see that. Actually, interestingly, you're mostly in the top half. Beyond starting work, have identified priority issues. 1%, which is one person, would have audited the sites and confident will meet all the requirements. But sadly, 10% of you are, or 9% of you are saying no idea where to start. So, you can see the spread, and hopefully that gives you a sense that where you are now may not be unusual, and that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully. So if I end that poll, then share the results. You can see some of this now. So you can see that the most popular one has had a few meetings and started to think about it. Sorry, I saw somebody put their hand up there, but here we go. Your poll was missing an option for very concerned about it, but unable to get senior management to show any interest whatsoever.
Brilliant.
I guess if I put that one in, that would have been 100%, potentially. Yeah, very concerned about it, but unable to get senior management to show any interest whatsoever. I think, what I'm sure you're finding is that there's a lot of technical requirements here that have been thrown up into the air, but equally it's the seriousness with which they're going to be addressed, because therefore the resources will follow. I'm sure that's where lots of people are feeling a little bit unsure about how much they're going to be able to invest in solving some of these problems until senior management understand the seriousness of them. So yes, I would say that would be a common answer. So I'm just going to check which sectors you're from. This is another poll so that we can at least make sure that we're aiming towards the right sort of content. How many of you from universities or central government, charities? We've, just to be clear, we've typically been focusing on HE. We've got a lot more experience in that area. There are other organizations working around all of these areas, business and charity and universities. The university stuff does contain a few things that are quite particular to universities, in particular virtual learning environments. A lot of the regulations will apply broadly to any of these sectors, but we have been connected into the university sector for some time. So we are finding we're tending to focus on that the most in terms of our own knowledge and expertise. But we're obviously interested in making sure we meet the needs of anybody who's here today, and also that we understand the needs as they change, because they may apply differently in different sectors. So I've got most people have answered, and just to show you, we are primarily today, most attendees are from the university sector, 70%. So that's related as well to how we've advertised it. So, but we're definitely interested in the other areas as well. And if questions come up that are outside that, then we'll do our best to answer them today, or we may decide that we need to do something differently in the future. Somebody's asking about what we put in our statements. You'll be pleased to know that's exactly what we're going to be covering today. So whether or not you have one or two or several across different sites, and what the standards are in terms of that compliance. Somebody from FE, but yes, that's very similar to HE as far as we understand it. And not-for-profit would be charity, I think, in this instance. We haven't clearly identified that. Great. Okay, so let's crack on. I'm going to introduce Natalie. Natalie's going to, Abby. Abby's going to talk to us a little bit about the position and the updates that have been going on around us. Abby, you sit on a working group, I think, with sitting around the table with government, don't you? Can you tell us a bit about that process?
So actually, our other speakers, Ben and George, are also involved in that working group, and Ben's been a key in trying to engage with government digital services. So there are about 5 or 6 of us who have tried to engage with government digital services and other stakeholders like Department for Education, Office of Students, Universities UK, etc. And through that, we try and collate information, ask questions. So in this update, I just wanted to flag some new resources, some new information that may help people who are either just starting out on their journey about the regulations or have some critical questions, and present sort of as much as we know. So since we did the webinar just at the beginning of May, Government Digital Services did publish some more guidance, still not that in depth, but they published particularly a document called Making Your Website and App Accessible. And in that, they flagged up what they called a sample accessibility statement. So that is now available because they legally had to provide that. And I'm sure George and Ben will go into that in much more detail because that's what we're going to be talking about today. But it also provided some very high-level technical requirements about what accessibility is. At the same time, late April, beginning of May, we did have a meeting between some of us and a representative from GDA, where we asked some questions that have been cropping up in the university sector, and we've collated those. They're currently in a Google Drive document. There's a link in the slides, and I've put a link to the SlideShare version, or we can flag up them in the chat pane as well. And that gives some discussion about disproportionate burden, and in particular third-party content, which is quite critical for universities, in that the government has made it clear that if you are purchasing content or systems, then it does fall under the regulations, in that a university or public sector organisation is responsible for that. Another document that we've just published literally on Tuesday, and we talked about it yesterday on a different session, is we've been trying to look at the timelines and deadlines for things like documents, intranet, website. It is very complicated in the regulations. So there is an article on the LexDis website, which is advice about digital accessibility, that you can go to. And also there is, at the bottom of that article, is a link to a set of slides, which Alistair McNaught has put together with some nice diagrams, and then some tables with, actual timelines, deadlines, to work out if, when you publish the document, when does it actually have to come under the regulations, etc. So those are some things that are still in the pipeline. In terms of engagement with government digital services, it's become more difficult. They've lost a couple of staff that were working on the regulations. We were also due to meet the minister, which was great, except it got postponed. So many of the questions that people are asking, they are on the list to get further advice from GDS. Unfortunately, a lot of the time when we ask for guidance, they say, individual organisations have to go back to their legal advisors. We don't think that is practical. We think that GDS should be telling us exactly who they are going to monitor and how they are going to monitor organisations, and that is something we will continue to stress to them. Mark, if you can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, sorry, just answering a question there.
Yeah. No problem.
Yeah.
So finally, another document they released did set out their monitoring and enforcement process, did explain that monitoring would be done by government digital services, and that is their sample they have to legally take each year. And it also sets out that the enforcement process will be through the Equality and Human Rights Organisation. However, that process we know isn't fixed yet. That's internal discussion still going on between GDS and EHRC. But within that document is a really clear statement, which is something GDS have put out really in response to people raising questions and queries about the regulations, where they're not sure whether they are covered by them. And I think this is quite important for us to take back to senior managers and leaders within the university and FE sector as well, that says, in terms of if you think you're exempt or you think something is exempt under the regulations, for example, you're saying it's a disproportionate burden, under the Equality Act 2010 or the Northern Ireland equivalent, you're still legally required to make reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities when they're needed. So it's really saying, even in all these nuts and bolts about the regulations, we still have an overarching responsibility under the Equality Act to provide reasonable adjustments. And in these regulations, we've got a clear stance that reasonable adjustments equals digital accessibility. So I think that's a really nice piece of text if you need somebody to get somebody's attention, really. So hopefully the links in those slides will help people to have some reading to do after this session. And I'm sure there'll be some questions we can answer later on as well. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Abby. I mean, I think I just want to pick up something in here, because I think this is a good example of where obviously some of the details are coming clearer, is that there is a point in here in a couple of places about the difference between HE and FE. Is that specifically laid out as a difference in the requirements, or is it maybe more a case that their context is different for each of them, and so therefore the response is going to be different?
So in the regulations, there isn't any difference.
No.
The only part of education that is exempt is schools and nurseries, and even then content that has to be accessed by the public still needs to be accessible. We are having discussions with Department for Education on that, as we feel they need to give the guidance to schools and colleges. So there may be something coming down from that route to inform leaders of their statutory requirements as such. I think the difference may be in the size of the college, that disproportionate burden then becomes more of a play. If you are not dealing with tens of thousands of students, you're dealing with thousands or smaller, then obviously disproportionate burden may be something that you can demonstrate if you feel that it's not possible to do it. However, Ofsted are also aware of these regulations, and they are starting to look at digital accessibility in their inspection framework as well. So under the Equality Act and Children and Families Act's responsibility. So although the FE sector sort of sometimes feels like the piggy in the middle between HE and schools, there is still a clear reason that they need to meet digital accessibility standards.
Cool, thank you. And I think that's helpful, and hopefully anyone from the FE sector can see that the difference is not that you're not affected by it, maybe just that your response may be different. And somebody saying it's not about wanting to avoid it. It's obviously that there's also a lot of strategic top-down lobbying needed. Somebody's mentioned in here about the providers and national strategic bodies. You're not describing a situation where everybody's sitting around the table and getting on and doing it. You're describing a situation where it's quite difficult to engage with some of the key people.
Absolutely.
And they keep changing. So I think that's the point, isn't it? That isn't deliberate. That's just the way things are in government at the moment. So.
Yeah, very particularly. And at the moment, actually, the HE sector is being seen as an example leading in this field, that what these webinars and the work from the GIS group and what we've been doing is seen as leading across other sectors as well. I think with FE, it's particularly the engagement with Department for Education, and as part of their EdTech strategy, they have an assistive technology expert group that's just formed. Myself and Alistair McNaught sit on that, and it is on the agenda for the next meeting about the regulations. So there's a definite awareness that FE does get overlooked, and we're particularly interested to get FE more engaged with the issue.
Great. Brilliant, thank you. So that's, as you can see, it's a changeable picture. It's why we're doing the updates. There are lots of stuff going on. In the last session, there was a lot of questions that we couldn't answer about what the intentions were and the overall direction. Some of that's clearer, some of it is not clearer. Hopefully will become clear. In terms of our own updates, we've introduced some training courses that we're running starting at the end of the month. Abby's running 2 sessions in July, then a pause for August, and then 2 more in September. These are paid for courses, they're not free. There'll be smaller numbers, and they're an hour and a half long. They'll be delivered online, and you can go in and book those now. They're £90 each, or you can get 4 for the price of 3 if you book all of them. What we're trying to do is provide insights that will be valuable across your digital teams. They're not necessarily specifically about these regulations, although they're clearly informed by them, and in particular, developing and maintaining an accessibility statement will obviously be taken in the context of the requirements. But we're also conscious that we want to help people raise their skills generally, and that may not be you who's on this call. You might have joined because you are one of the sort of accessibility leads and you want others in your team to know more. And so we're hoping this program can help fill some of those gaps. There's a booking form online, and you can go in and do that. You see the first ones in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So that's an update from our side in terms of things that we're providing. So moving on to accessibility statements. Natalie, if I can introduce you, and if you can tell us a bit about the basics of accessibility statements, and then we'll go on and talk to Ben and George about what they've done with their accessibility statement.
Sure. Well, okay, hi. As you can see on this particular slide, legally and internationally, there are many laws in different countries which help prevent against discrimination of people who are disabled. Essentially, we want to create products that are inclusive for all. So the new regulations that came into force for the UK public sector on the 23rd of September 2018 is called, it's quite a mouthful, it's called Public Sector Bodies, Websites and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations 2018. Okay, so this regulation it basically aims to ensure that the public sector websites and mobile apps will need to meet certain accessibility standards and are accessible to all users, and especially those with disabilities. So the public sector bodies include central government and local government organizations, and some charities and other non-government organizations. So a public sector body would need to do 2 things essentially. You'd need to meet the international WCAG 2.1 AA accessibility standard, and you'd need to publish an accessibility statement that explains how accessible your website or app is. If we can go to the next slide, Mark. So I mentioned you need to publish an accessibility statement. So what is that? Well, an accessibility statement is essentially a declaration on your website that defines the level of web accessibility the website or app aims to achieve. So firstly, the public sector bodies will need to assess whether the regulations apply, and if so, whether compliance would be a disproportionate burden. So a disproportionate burden, I mean, Abby did mention it, but is what the 2018 regulations refer to when the impact of fully meeting the requirements is too much for an organization to reasonably cope with. If, however, compliance is required, a review of existing and planned websites and apps should be carried out in line with the implementation timetable, which I will be showing in a few minutes. And an accessibility statement should then be prepared and published where necessary. So why do we need to do this? Next slide, Mark. Well, it's law. Non-compliance could result in discrimination and reputational damage, and it's a way to communicate to your users how you're currently supporting their needs. So if someone comes to your site, you want them to easily see what can they do, what can't they do, what are you doing about it to improve it. So just some more information on it. What would you include in this? Well, Ben and George shortly will be going through it, their hands-on approach. But in a nutshell, there are numerous bits of information you need to include. You need to state which parts of your service are accessible, which are not, and if not, why, and with the intention of what you're going to do to improve it, and providing alternatives to content that is not accessible. So measures taken by your organization to ensure accessibility, have an evaluation done on your site, how much do you comply, are there any exceptions or limitations, because sometimes despite our best efforts, there are areas of the websites that fall outside of the intended web accessibility targets. So we need to acknowledge these and say, these are the limitations and this is what we're doing about them. You need to have some contact information to report any problems, technical prerequisites, so which browsers are currently supported. It's good to have the various environments on which the accessibility was tested on, and then references to applicable national or local laws and policies. Okay, so how many accessibility statements do you need, and where would you find them? Well, each public sector body will be slightly different, so it depends how many systems or websites you have, but essentially you need to bring all that information together into a coherent form and basically put it in one batch together, but also depending on how many sites or systems you have, you might need numerous statements for each one. So it is dependent. Where would you find it? Well, you need to make it as easy to find as possible. So you can have numerous links to it from several prominent areas. For example, your footer, the About Us page, or the help menu, but the main goal is you want to make it as easy to find as possible. So the timelines that we mentioned, okay, so the new public sector body websites, being those published on or after the 23rd of September 2018, must conform to the accessibility standards by this September 2019. This includes existing intranets and extranets. So this means that it's not only public websites, but internal systems within your digital estate that, for instance, your staff might use. Existing public sector body websites, so sites created before the 23rd of September 2018, must conform by September 2020. And if you're a public sector body that publishes mobile apps, then you must comply by June 2021. So that was it in a nutshell, but next up we have George Rhodes from Kent County Council and Ben Watson from the University of Kent, who will tell you about their journey and their collaboration in creating their web accessibility statements and the process they use to develop the content.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natalie. Thank you. And George, Ben, I don't know which one of you's got a hand on the mouse, but we were going to give you control of the screen at this point. So I'm just going to sort that out and jump over. So could you give us a bit of context in the sense of, you know, your respective roles in the organisations and how you came to be working on this together?
Okay, George is going to set up the statements. Yeah, I'm Ben Watson. I'm the Accessible Information Advisor at the University of Kent, and we've been working on a project called the Opera Project, which has preceded these regulations by a couple of years. So we very serendipitously, we were already working on making our learning and teaching materials more accessible, or trying to raise awareness of those things around good inclusive design for learning and teaching, seminar materials, lecture materials. So these regulations actually came along at just the right time for us to kind of further that role, really. George is actually a graduate of the university, so already had a good relationship with the university, and Kent County Council, through the partnership work that George was already doing with the university, had various links with, for example, the School of Computing around embedding accessibility awareness as a kind of transferable graduate attribute within the School of Computing students. So that was the kind of initial involvement. But at the point that the regulations were a bit more kind of firmed up and it was clear about what the responsibilities were, it became very clear to us that there was a great opportunity to not reinvent the wheel and to share resources and expertise as two public sector organisations that had exactly the same commitments and requirements under these regulations to share the learning that we'd already done and the expertise that we'd developed for the greater good. So that's definitely the kind of background to it. Do you want to say about your role, George?
Yeah, so I'm the Digital Accessibility Compliance Lead for KCC currently, and where we sort of come into this is exactly as Ben said. We already had some interaction going on with the university trying to embed accessibility skills with the School of Computing, but it was really nice when we discovered this sort of shared group that we should be working with and started talking about what we can do, particularly because the university and KCC had both started approaching this from different perspectives. So Kent County Council, unsurprisingly as a council, started approaching this from a very compliance-based viewpoint, very much about the letter of the regulations, how we're going to do auditing, and that side of things. Whereas the university was more focused on the product for the end user and how it actually affects students and how we really make sure our services are as best as possible for the end users. And it was really beneficial to sort of be covering off the bases that each other had missed up to that point. So it was really, really, really valuable to find somebody else who'd been looking at this, but from a completely different perspective.
Cool. So just as before we dive in, somebody mentioned about senior management buy-in. How much of what you just said reflects the fact that buy-in was there in the first place, or how much it reflects that you've been allowed to get on with this and everybody's happy that you've done it?
Good question.
Getting involvement from senior managers is always an ongoing process. We've had, I'd say both of us have had senior management see the value in what we're doing, allows us to get on with it, and where we've had this sort of relationship with the university and the council for a long time anyway, it's through well-worn channels that everyone's used to. But it is still a constant challenge speaking to senior management, getting them to understand the scale that we've got to cover in the next, we're in July now, so 14 months, something like that, for 2019. 2020 deadline, sorry.
I think it's been really helpful. I mean, George has attended. We have a local digital accessibility working group where it's a kind of strategy group for how the university is going to meet these regulations. And George being involved in that has not only given us this different perspective, and George has already mentioned that Kent County Council was strong in areas the university wasn't, and hopefully, we're able to kind of pay the council back in a slightly different way, the sort of more the user journey focus that we originally took. But I also think that in terms of the senior management buy-in, having the local council kind of similarly reinforce the messages that we're making to senior management has actually really worked in our favour. So it's not just Ben's team within the university that's nibbling away at people. It's it's very clearly an external force that the university needs to work with. And I have to say that the senior management in the university have all been really, really good about this, and it's something that the university really feels strongly about. So that has felt pretty much like we're pushing an open door, but there's obviously a lot of kind of culture change that needs to happen at every level, which is something we're currently working on.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really interesting. And I mean, I think that as the story unfolds, there's a few elements in there that you mentioned, like your digital accessibility working group, that others may be interested in knowing more about as well, because that may be a reason why you've had some of those open doors to push through. So could you take us through where you are with your statement then? You've got a few slides, a few things here to run through on the internet, and just tell us a bit about what you've got in there and how you arrived at it.
Yeah, sure thing. So we both published our accessibility statements at the same time, back on the 5th of June. So they've been live for just over a month now. I looked at the analytics, interestingly, yesterday, and we're up to around 700 page views on it in the last month, which is really sort of positive. I think we haven't had any complaints back yet. We haven't had any sort of negative feedback about the statements at all, which has been really good, because I think one of the first questions that sort of pops up when we were talking about doing all this was if we start publishing where our known issues are and start committing to things on the accessibility statement, then aren't people going to start swarming us with challenges and questions? And so far, the first month, touch wood, that's not been the case. It's just been valuable information that's now up on the website and is being looked at. So we published our statements a month ago. We've done them for both the University of Kent's main website and KCC's main website, kent.gov. Obviously, both of us have quite sort of vast web estates across our organisations. So not all of the domains that we own and support have accessibility statements yet, but we are in the process of rolling out and getting people to adopt the ones we've finished. But we have put one up, both of our websites, exactly the same. University of Kent one with university language tweaks, and KCC with the organisation specific tweaks for us as well.
Ben, that's what removes the captions. What you just did.
Sorry. Sorry, Mark. If you control that, if you could we were just useful to flash one of them up. I think.
Yeah. That's it. That's so the captions are on that. You can go ahead. You can still scroll down, but
maximising the screen problem.
Yeah.
So this is just an example of the how the University of Kent one is laid out. If you were to jump straight into the Kent County Council one, you'll see that in almost every way, formatting, the cosmetics of it, they are identical, except for, of course, where the contact us bits lead and any sort of immediate local variations. But the ultimate kind of vision that we have is that we're going to try and work together in ways beyond the statement as well. So we've shared procurement guidance, so that if you're a supplier coming to Kent and you come to the university in the morning and you go to County Hall in the afternoon, you're going to get the same set of questions, the same robust kind of grilling about the accessibility of your platform or your resource. And I think one of the really lovely things about the partnership is not only do we share resources, and that means we can travel further with the resources we have, but I think it gives people, certainly gives us locally a greater level of reassurance that we've got an ability to kind of check our thinking with another organisations that's similarly kind of minded to do the same things that we're doing. So it doesn't. I think there's an awful lot of fear factor around these regulations, possibly because there's not been an awful lot of guidance coming centrally. So it does feel like we're all finding our way. So finding a really, really kind of helpful ally locally, I think, has been really helpful. And I think that was one of the guiding lights for Abby and I when we were looking at setting up something like the further higher education digital accessibility working groups, was that we wanted to kind of create that voice so that people could just ask those questions and get some general reassurance.
And that's locally, that's expanding now as well, because although KCC and the university have been pushing on this, we're now starting to get a lot more involvement from all of our other districts and boroughs, parishes, things like that. I won't go on about the conference we just held locally, and that we're supposed to be talking about accessibility statements, but we are getting a lot more buy-in from our local group as well, which is fantastic. Yeah. So yeah, I think first let's have a look at GDS's sample statement, which will just help us sort of explain why and where we've done some things differently.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that most people who've come on the webinar today have at least had a bit of a glance at GDS's sample accessibility statement. If not, the point I would give. Sorry, there we go. The sort of overview I would give of it is, I see it as a selection of building blocks that you can use to make an accessibility statement, but I wouldn't necessarily say that the order in which they are is a viable accessibility statement for you to effectively copy and paste. I think they've got most of the start of good wording there, but I think there are a few bits that need adjustment, and you need to be fairly well versed in the subject to be able to pick out where bits don't really make sense from their statement. So one of my first comments about their guidance is that throughout it, they don't take some of the opportunities that they could to point users in alternate paths where something isn't accessible. There's one particular part as well that I think really demonstrates that this is a building blocks thing, where each paragraph, each little sentence can be used, but not necessarily in this exact order. Sorry, let me just try and find it. I've clearly gone past it. The bit I'm looking for, if anyone spots it before I do, give me a shout. But the bit I'm looking for, here we are. The bit I was looking for is this, where it's saying issues with technology. Their thing here, which you could take as a few building blocks, says no skipped content on the main page. Text doesn't reflow, and then not possible for users to modify text spacing. These three issues are under issues with technology, and at the end they've plonked the we'll assess the cost of fixing this, but it would be a disproportionate burden section at the end. And I would never say that skip to content would fall under a disproportionate burden. And also, you know, they don't then sort of go into detail about how they've proved that, or how you can ask to see some detail as to why it's a disproportionate burden. So I think the wording there is good, but you need to know the orders in which to put it to make an accessibility statement that not only meets the tick boxes for the regulations, but also actually provides something useful to the end users. So that was one of the other areas that we really thought is where ours differs in focus from GDS's one. GDS's one, understandably, seems to focus on what you need to say to meet the regulatory requirements, which is fine. Another area I think that is missing in the GDS one, and it was interesting that this was mentioned earlier on the webinar, was third-party content, and a more in-depth view on that. Theirs is, I can't remember if they mention it at all or they only mention it slightly, but it wasn't as in-depth, certainly, as I think it should be.
I think the kind of ethos of ours was that I think the accessibility statement, obviously, as George says, you know, should tick all the right boxes in terms of what you have to do to meet the regulations. But I think we saw it as more of an opportunity to help people get more from our site, you know. So we've tried to point people at tools that will improve their digital experience. whether or not they have a print disability or not, we just think that's a really good thing to be able to do. And an awful lot of the tools that we point people out, it's a university curated list of, we call them productivity tools, but they include a lot of things that have traditionally, been recommended in disabled students' allowances and stuff like that, are now being used in Kent public libraries, to support people who are, trying to develop their IT confidence and digital literacy. So I think there's lots of really good opportunities. I don't think your accessibility statement has to just be seen as this core document around legal compliance. It's a really good chance to sing a kind of about the broader opportunities to get more from your website, and that's definitely the way. So we've actually ended up splitting it to create a kind of user-friendly, plain English kind of version of the statement, which is the one we're primarily promoting to our wide range of users across the university and the local council. But then similarly, we do have a technical version, which is where we fully outline how we meet the regulations.
So can we jump to that? Sorry, I'm just conscious of the time as well. If we can see the sample, because I think that the questions that will follow from that, you're picking up a lot of it anyway. But
so one of the things I was going to mention is actually there is some regulatory sense in us taking this approach as well, because one of the first things that we looked at when me, Ben, Abby and others were looking at accessibility statements, and these came out of it, was the EU directives AJAX appendix, I think it was called, and within that's split into two sections. Section 1, which is what you've got to say for the regulations, and Section 2, which was optional, which was provide more information that is valuable to the users. So if anyone looks that up, that lends some weight to why we changed this over. So yeah, to get back on track, because I know we're conscious of time, ours is split into, as Ben says, 3 main areas. The what we termed the plain English statement, which is our main statement. That's the one on the screen now, the KCC one. This was set for your everyday user who actually wants to complete tasks, wants to know how they can get on, and in what ways we're committed to accessibility and how they get the best out of our site. So we've got a lot of content on navigation, listening to content, the productivity tools that Ben mentioned, using different devices, alternate formats, web standards, which is then where we link off to our technical accessibility statement, where we say a lot more, and our auditing process. What we do about known issues, which is then where we split off to our third section, which is the known issues list. Third-party content. Now, as you can see, ours on third-party content is quite a hefty section of the accessibility statement, because the more we thought about it, the more different situations we thought could come up when it comes to third-party content. Interestingly, for the toolkit, we'll shortly be releasing publicly with a lot of our guidance in and the procurement stuff and everything else. We'll have a lot more third-party content guidance in there, including almost a sort of matrix that you could go through to work out whether you really are responsible for a particular scenario with third-party content or not. So that's hopefully going to be something quite valuable. Video, audio, and downloads, and then we get into, and this is the bit that does slightly change if we're talking about contact us, how to get in touch with us, because from the conversations we've had with Abby, with GDS, the escalation process to us, and these conversations took place before GDS really announced their part of it, was they expect users to contact you and reasonably go through your internal complaints process first before it would get to the stage where it needs to be escalated to GDS as a monitoring body, to the EHRC as the enforcement body, and then progressed in the same way as the Equalities Act challenge. And I think that's fairly sensible, and that's why GDS has been more supportive than sort of punitive so far when talking to people about the regulations, and that seems to be their plan going forwards.
But I think it's because we've taken this hopefully quite a positive approach to it. Just at the top of the bit where it says contacting us and what happens next, we're keen to know about areas where we need to make improvements, but we're equally keen to know about things that are good, and that we because then we can build case studies from those to say, look, people really like this element of our webpage. So I think I'm hoping people are seeing this as something quite positive. I mean, I think, as George mentioned, there was initially a kind of concern about, well, if you put your statement out there, what are you encouraging? But we're just encouraging, hopefully, a really positive interaction and a user kind of centered experience of our web pages. And it's actually really helpful for us to know when something isn't quite right, because of course then we get the opportunity to put it right. But it's also useful to know where people are having a good experience, because then we can do more of those things and we wouldn't inadvertently switch one of those off.
Cool. Can I so I'm sorry, I think I've got a couple of questions coming in, and I'm going to try and finish by 2. So I think what I'm seeing is how much breadth there is to this question. And clearly there's lots of different bits that you're working on. I think the point today was there's a few things that are significant, I think, rather than this element we did this element we did that. The collaboration that you're working on illustrates 2 things. One is it's good to work with somebody else on it. And the other is actually there's not that much difference between what you're doing in your 2 respective organizations. That you may consider that the university and the council may end up with different statements, but actually that doesn't appear to be what's turning out. So I think that's very interesting. And also we're going to provide links to all of this stuff. So I'm very conscious that with 10 minutes left, I think we've got to be careful we don't turn into like a long detailed examination of every element. It's actually showing that that's what somebody's got to do. That's the point of the exercise, isn't it? We had to go through this bit by bit, work out our answers. The other bit that's very interesting is that you're trying to take an approach which is not the checklist one. And it would appear to me that the guidance as it stands at the moment isn't quite up to scratch, because you don't yet know. So you're being positive about that, using other signposts as well. And I think that's important. Looking at some of the questions that are coming in, they're saying, do you think we should do this, or do you think we should do that? And I think the answer you're saying is, well, think about what's best for the person who's using the site, and the sort of positive messaging you're trying to do, and do your best to achieve that. And where you haven't done that, then be clear that there may need to be an alternative, or there's something that you aren't able to do. And I think that's a very important answer, because there is still a lot of unknowns about what the regulations are actually what they're going to measure, what they're going to expect of you. So I think that's important. I've got a couple of quick questions. One of them, somebody said that, and we're fighting over the mice here, just so you know, so that I can see it. And somebody mentioned there's no graphics and icons on it. Have you deliberately done a sort of a text-based approach to this? Did you consider alternative ways of communicating some of the information within the statement?
When we were thinking about it, there never occurred a time when we needed pictures or anything like that. I mean, certainly you could make some of this more visually appealing, but there was just never a time when we thought.
I mean, would there be a case for using Makaton, I guess, would be another question, or some other language where the communications is the point rather than the prettiness of it, that there may be people who would want to communicate using some sort of icon-based language that they're familiar with.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm guessing that's part of the question as well, is the sense that there's different ways of communicating information, and you've used text. I think the question would be how you would do that next and where it fits into the needs of your users, I guess. Yeah. Rather than a complete reproduction of everything.
I think it's nice. I mean, even if people, and I see this as an iterative thing, that this isn't necessarily the statement we're always going to have. Over time, this will develop based on more feedback that we get, both from our members of staff in the organisation, web developers, but also more importantly our users. So I think it will definitely evolve. So this was our first kind of opening account, but I think the idea is now that we've got a framework, and this has helped to kind of generate further awareness raising within the organisation, that people can see the kinds of things that an accessibility statement would contain, and therefore the sorts of work that goes into improving that overall position, the accessibility maturity of your organisation. So I think it's a positive thing. I really do.
Yeah. And it's a journey, isn't it? That's the other thing. So some particular question, what was the process behind the testing? What sort of testing have you done to arrive at the results that you have?
We sort of really tried to thoroughly test this with as many stakeholders as possible. So obviously this was developed in conjunction with AbilityNet, JISC and Policy Connect. So we had other experts look at this when we were building it. Our statements were looked at by plain English experts to help us get the wording more straightforward. They were looked at by our legal teams, so that we know they were happy with it from their understanding. It was looked at by our digital and web development teams.
Sorry, can I just check? I think it actually means, did you test your website, not did you test your statement?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Did you audit your website to then arrive at the statement?
Yeah, we both have very sort of active auditing processes behind the scenes for exactly to, the statement is, as Natalie said, is only part of the journey, and that you then also have to kind of audit your site to understand what your known issues are and how you're going to address them. So we both have very active processes. Again, wherever possible, we're sharing the same methodologies of auditing our site. So they're both being sort of audited pretty much in exactly the same way. So yeah, that's actively going on, and very much that is indirectly informing the ongoing evolution of the statement, in that a lot of the outcomes of those audits are the things that are informing or will inform the known issues section that George mentioned. Yeah.
And do you do that internally or externally? Do you both use the same agency?
We audit internally at the moment. We've found it, in our experience, to work quite well developing the skills in-house.
Great.
And actually KCC have helped us as a university. We use students as well. We're training students up to understand how to, under supervision, but understand how to do this auditing with the ultimate goal that this is a graduate attribute we would like them to have, to understand about building accessibly into the work they do going forwards.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I'm trying to see if we can stop at 2. So, Abby, I think you've got a couple of bits you just want to jump in on some of the details here about. I am keen to see if we can answer them after the call, if we can, particularly the ones trying to clarify what the dates are, because they are in the regulations.
Yes, the dates. I've actually put a link into the chat pane to the article that was published yesterday about timelines. In terms of intranets, they are exempt until the intranet is substantially updated, and then they have to meet the regulations by September 2020. The unknown is, what is the legal definition of substantially revised? We did get some advice actually from Marion Deepwood, who runs ALT, Association of Learning Technologists, who felt that actually for an intranet, for most universities, after about a year, there is so much content that has changed. Obviously, modules are revised, that would be a sort of general timeline for intranet content being revised. From our expertise in doing accessibility audits, again, we would say after 12 months our audits would be out of date, given how much websites do get updated. So when you are thinking about, am I actually looking at a new website, you need to think about both the content and the background coding behind the content. I think generally, to be on the safe side, even having an accessibility statement on your intranet is a good idea from as soon as possible, even if you are saying, we haven't audited everything yet, we haven't checked everything for now, because it may be exempt until 2020. The government, the actual responsibility for checking whether accessibility statements has been undertaken is the responsibility of the Cabinet Office. And as I understand it, they have naming and shaming powers to say there isn't an accessibility statement there, and the Office of Students is aware of that as well, and it might be a tool that they will look at when looking at widening participation and access plans as well. So I think in terms of the actual statement, it's better to do it as early as possible and add to it, as George and Ben have said. Do I have time to answer another question?
No, I'm afraid you don't.
We just have to do another
Honestly,
webinar.
I think so. The next question I'm going to ask of people in here is it useful to have these updates? I mean, I'm very conscious, that it's very difficult to answer questions because there's so much that's changing. And so, I think we're doing the updates rather than, this is not a training session. This is actually just saying, hey, we know this at the moment. This is what we're working on. And I think that's coming across in last session and the next one. And I think that the idea will be that we do more of these. So I'm just struggling with my technology now. I just want to do one final question for the people attending. I can spot a spelling mistake in there as well. But how useful have you found the update session? Because we want to be careful that we don't end up digging so deep that you don't get anything from this. And on the other hand, if this sort of format works for you in the future, then of course we can continue to host these. So AbilityNet has an interest in education being accessible rather than the regulations being clear. We want to make sure that what you're doing in your institutions is delivering accessible education to as many people as possible, and clearly we can help support that in lots of different ways. And I will just go back to the training because I think it's obvious that there's a lot of requirements in this area that aren't clear, but it's equally important, as George and Ben have said, that you realize that this is actually an ongoing need, that you need to develop skills and training and resources in-house. It's very interesting that you've invested in doing your own in-house testing because we advocate that as well. We think that you should be using either some of the freely available tools to do simple testing or investing in some of the paid for tools that mean that your team then has the right tools at their disposal. That's what we do within our services, but equally you could be doing the same thing. And that's why we think training is a big part of the answer. So we're highlighting that. There's lots of other training. Jessica's done some as well. And there's other training around that may or may not be relevant to particular parts of the picture. As I say, I'm trying to hurry along so that we can say that we finished it on the hour. Thank you so much, Ben and George. That was brilliant. I think you might be back. I think there might be more to see and more to learn. I'm interested as well in the model in how you've collaborated. I think a lot of people will want to go away and think about how they can find other people to work with separately to what you've actually produced. So I think that was really valuable to see that combination. Thank you, Natalie, for introducing accessibility statements. And thank you, Abby, for keeping us all bang up to date with the latest news about what's going on. Everybody who's on the call, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it useful. As I say, everything we've done will be recorded. We'll be sharing useful links afterwards. You can find updates and other information around the internet. But you can also, if you aren't on our mailing list, join our mailing list because this is the type of information that will be circulating through our emails. And I can see, if I end the poll, you can see that if you thought it was useful, you're in the 94% of people who've answered. And if we have update sessions in the future, it looked like then we should be doing some more of these. And I think our plan